Good afternoon, everybody. This is Ari Karen, and I'm here this afternoon. We're going to do a webinar on the Americans with Disabilities Act and lender websites. I'm just going to give it a second or two. I know we've got a bunch of people logging on right now, so let's just give it about a minute and we'll get started. Thanks a lot. Okay, so we're going to get started now. Let's kind of start off with an understanding of exactly what the ADA, how it applies to the websites. And you know, this is titled website, you know, lender websites. It's really websites in general, but obviously we're going to tailor our discussion to the industry. So let's first understand what the Americans with Disabilities Act, how it applies. So this is the language right out of the act, and what it basically says is you're not going to discriminate against somebody who has a disability, and this is the key word, and the full and equal enjoyment of goods, services, and facilities. You know, really circle that word of any place, and circle another word or two words, public accommodation. So the question really is, we deal with websites. Is this really a discrimination on the basis of disability and with respect to access or enjoyment of a place of public accommodation? That's really what they're asking. Now, the reason, you know, we get into this a little bit also is that when we talk about discrimination, that includes essentially an omission, right? The failure to take steps that would ensure that everybody has equal access to these places of public accommodation. So, for example, it's why if you were in a restaurant, you would see, you know, that they would have ramps and steps maybe, or that the bathrooms would have, you know, an area for persons with disabilities. So it's essentially that concept of equal access to facilities. That's the key thing that you do. And the reason it really gets into, and you may say, well, okay, websites, what are you talking about? Websites. Why are websites that's in my house, right? That's not a place of public accommodation. Well, this is really where the courts understand this is a developing area of the law. Okay, it is not something that's like set in stone like everything else. And there's really two main schools of thought you got to understand. One is that if you have a website and that website somehow is a nexus, a connection to the goods sold at a physical location, then it's a place of public accommodation. So let me explain what that means. Let's say that you have a website. Let's just use an example here. And it tells you the different products, the different types of loan products, and it tells you, you know, what the requirements were for each or what the benefits are of each, and explains them. And so then you would be in a position to get a mortgage. And let's say you have a physical mortgage office, then you know that would have that nexus. Taking it out of the mortgage context, let's say you had a sporting goods store and you were able to go on the website and see, okay, I want to buy, what kind of different sized footballs do you have and different types of footballs do you have? Because that would allow you to almost pre-shop, right? It would allow you to perform some of the things to even determine, should I go to that store? Do they sell footballs? What are the store hours? Where are their locations? Can you get me directions to that? All the things that would facilitate a visit to that store and facilitate a purchase of the goods and services at that store, it would have the necessary nexus to make that a place of public accommodation. Let me give you another example. I have a friend who who started a company or works for a company called Covenant Mortgage, and you know they let me look at their website at when this was some time ago, and it was just really all like, it wasn't anything about the products they sold at the time, right? And this has probably changed, but they had it was all more like stuff about them, like who they were, how they got into the mortgage business, sort of the kind of touchy-feely stuff you might see on websites. That would not be an example of something that would have had the necessary nexus, because it really doesn't help you shop. I mean, it's nice information, but it's more just fluffy stuff, right? In that example, that wouldn't have the nexus. But now let's change it and say one thing. Now let's say you're not in one of these circuits, the 9th, 3rd, 6th, 11th, right? Now let's say you were in the 2nd and 7th or 1st. And I know you're wondering what these circuits mean. It's really not that important. Different places in the country is what it comes down to, okay? But what they say in those circuits is it doesn't, as long as you can get something through the website, as long as it connects you to a business, it's a place of public accommodation, right? So you're just in, right? You're pretty much just in there. So now I will tell you the trend on both of these, there's two reasons, is increasingly that every website is a place of public accommodation. There's two reasons. One, websites are becoming much more functional, right? Like I told you about the example I gave you, which was a couple of years ago. Well, a couple of years ago, you think even 5 years ago, people didn't buy anything, not nearly as much as they do now through the internet, right? Websites were more just general marketing. Look at me, right? More publicity, advertising. They weren't functional. They didn't tell you information about how to shop or what to get or even how to buy it online. Not, you had some, but not the mass of them. But now, I mean, think of a website now that doesn't have a true functional purpose of either doing commerce directly or enabling the exercise of commerce. Almost every website does that now. So I think, and the courts are leaning more heavily, and the trend is that direction. So I think, and to some extent, this importance is going to go away over time, and you basically are going to be in a place where if you've got a website, you got to assume the ADA is going to comply. And I think that's pretty much how you should operate now. Again, if you get into the legal theories, it may not be totally correct, but I think given where we're all headed in this direction, that would be the rule that I would say is if you've got a website, don't worry about whether it is or whether it isn't. It probably is, and if it isn't now, it's going to be. So you might as well get prepared for that now. That's sort of how I would say you should think about it. Now, when you think about it, what are things that lenders might have on their website to make them subject to the ADA, even under these tests? And thinks about things like online application, information on their different products, contact information, how to contact them, when and where. And even in states where there's no brick or mortar, I mean, again, you get into these questions. So, but again, I would just kind of go down to the concept of assume that you're going to have that you're going to be required to have ADA compliance. And as you go through this, one other thing I wanted you to understand is that when you're looking at a potential case you might have, let's go to real world and the things that you might deal with. I know a lot of you guys have gotten letters, and the letters come from this company or firm or organization in DC, and it's threatening you with lawsuits. And I've talked to people who say, oh, well, I want to fight this, and I don't think that, my website's a place of public accommodation. Here, let me kind of tell you how I think that you can make a mistake. We're going to get to this a little bit later, and you're going to find that there isn't actually huge damages in these cases. Really, what most of these people want you to do is just turn your website into something that's compliant. And because there are not actually exact goals or exact standards of what is and what isn't compliant, that's a perfect thing that you can handle via some negotiation, working it out with the other side. Now, once you get into court and you start a legal battle of, is my website, ADA compliant, and does compliance even apply to my website? First of all, you're going to spend a lot of money. Second of all, your outcome is clearly not, guaranteed by any stretch of the imagination. And third, but this is the worst part of it, something that you might have been able to resolve informally, you now are going to have a judge deciding whether your website meets that standard. And because, again, that standard is not defined, you can get to, and this is, I've been pretty successful. I mean, when you deal with these cases, you go to the other side and you say, listen, you want me to be 100%, but for me to get to 90, from 98 where we are, or 98 where we could be for a couple dollars, to 100, that extra 2% is going to cost us a ton of money. So we're not going that. We're going to get to 98%, and that's going to have to be good enough for you, right? 99% of the time, they're okay with that. Actually, in my experience, I've been 100%, fortunately. They've been okay with that, and they work with you. The problem is, though, if you fight over that and you go to court, right, and a judge says, no, I want you to be 100, that 2% can cost a ton of money. So you're much better off trying to work these things out early and find out, get somebody to come in, you spend $1,500, $2,000, you get somebody to assess your website, you find out what it's going to cost to fix, you spend, $1,000, $2,000 on that, you don't incur much of attorney's fees and you're done. It's easy, right? But there's sort of a reaction some people get when they have these letters, and it's to say, well, we want to fight over everything. We think this is kind of BS. And one thing I want to kind of explain to you as now we go through this next section is it's really not legally, and I think practically when you hear a little bit more, it's not. But it's just the wrong approach to take in these scenarios because it costs you a lot more time, a lot more money, a lot more aggravation than it needs to be. And, let's kind of talk about what the things are that they're requiring so you understand when I say that. So look, you've got a website. Another example is, and I've seen these, websites that let's say have a black screen with red lettering. Now here's the thing, if you were somebody who were visually impaired in terms of you're colorblind, you can't distinguish black and red. You can fix that website by changing the red lettering to white lettering. Done. Easy, right? A lot of things are like that. They're very simple. Or for example, that your website has back coding, and listen, I'm not an IT person, so if I get some of these words wrong, don't yell at me here, but it's set up so that a screen reader for people who are visually impaired, the screen reader can read out to them what's on the screen. You also have scenarios that are where you have descriptive links for videos. Instead of a video with a picture with no link, not explaining what it is, which a screen reader can't read and a person who's visually impaired can't understand it's even there. So, if you had a video that was why you should do a fixed rate mortgage today, or why you should refinance into a fixed rate mortgage today, but it didn't have any caption. It was just, there, and someone would have to hit play. Just put a link on it, just put a descriptive link on it, and now you're potentially ADA compliant. It's a lot of these little things. Also, another thing you have to determine is, is it accessible by keyboard instead of a mouse? Is there alternate text on graphics so that if there's a picture, there's text, and where is that text put? Is it in the picture or is it out of the picture? And understand also that there are exceptions to ADA. I mean, if it was so hard to do these things, let's say you had, some type of video, and I can't even really come up with an example right now, but it was, a video about silly animal tricks, right? How could you make that ADA compliant? You couldn't really have a reader because there would all be videos. Even if you had descriptive links, what it's really going to do. So the point is, maybe in that case, right, the entire purpose of the website would be eradicated if you said it was inaccessible, or making it accessible, you couldn't do it. There are examples of that where if you can show, the purpose of the website would be eradicated by trying to do these things, then it's maybe an exception to the ADA, like an undue hardship type of standard. That's really not going to come in for you guys, but I just wanted you to know it was there. It is out there. Now, I mentioned this earlier. This is really important. So there's something called the World Wide Web Consortium Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. By the way, at the end of the webinar, you're going to have a test, and you have to say that 10 times really, really fast. I'm not even going to try to pass. So, but the key is that courts have looked to this as a standard, but this standard has not been adopted by any type of legislative body, and it is not actually the standard. Because there is really no other standard out there, it's sort of by default become the standard. But this is really important because when you're negotiating these things, if you ever get one of these letters, one of the things that's pretty effective to tell them is saying, hey, there is no standard. So when you're beating me over the head and telling me you got to do this and you got to do this and you got to do this, says who? Because that isn't really that you got to do any of this stuff, right? That's just a private company's what they think are the content accessibility guidelines. It's not official by any stretch of the imagination. And that helps you because as you kind of make your determination about where you are in terms of your website compliance from an ADA perspective and where they want you to be, there is no definitive answer. And you can use that to your advantage by simply determining, well, how far can I get without spending a ton of money, right? So I just had a case where my client was able to bring themselves to 97% 6%, compliance, and we were able to show all the problems that would come and how much money it would cost, and you're able to work that out. Now, I think every case is a little bit different, but what I suggest and what I strive to do is saying, when do we hit that law of diminishing returns? When do we hit that point where all of a sudden, instead of spending, $500, $1,000, we're spending $10,000? That's sort of your line of demarcation, if you will, where you want to try to settle it there. Because if they agree to it and you get yourself there, you're in pretty good shape. And, look, I've never had a case where I've had to get beyond that and we've really fought over this. That might be, though, if where you'd have to consider going to court. But fortunately, in most of these cases, and with most businesses, especially smaller businesses, it's not something that they want to do or you want to do, and it's unnecessary. There have been some states that have adopted this, but most don't. So understand that. There's also the fact that you can give alternatives. So for example, if you had a scenario, when I say alternative access, right? So it doesn't have to be the same access. Using the best example outside the lending industry, a ramp instead of steps, right? You can have ramp access, you can have steps access. So here, let's say that, it's got to be equal, it's got to be equivalent. So let's just say business hours, right? Or locations. And you said, and you couldn't, for whatever reason, make your website readable. And so you said, call this number if you want to hear our websites and, our locations and our hours at each location. You could have that alternative so somebody could pick up the phone and use that 24/7. Now you might say, well, why does it have to be 24/7? Well, because what if it's 10 o'clock at night and I could go on the internet and I could find out the locations and hours, but because you can't access it because of your disability, do we have equal access then? The answer would be no. So if you provide an alternative channel, such as a phone number you could call that would have a recording of that information, then in that case, it would work. Now, to be clear, a recording of information, that goes on for 26 minutes and is a speech might not do it, right? But in other words, if you had a couple locations and a couple hours, you probably could put that on as an alternative and thus still remain compliant even without changing the website. So those are also ways you can be compliant and address these issues without really incurring a ton of cost. One thing to know is that the real cost associated with this, though, is the compliance piece of it. And depending on how developed your website is and how complex and how much it can do, compliance can become very, very expensive to make an existing website compliant. So one thing I suggest to people is if they're doing their website or they're about to redo their website, pay attention to the ADA. Doing it while you're building your website is not usually that expensive. Once the website is built and you've got to deconstruct and reconstruct, it can become very, very expensive. Sometimes it's even better off to start over depending on what you had. So, that's something to keep in mind if you haven't built your website, you're planning to build it again or update it. Definitely pay attention to this. And one of the things I also highly recommend, make sure your web developer indemnifies you from this, right? You don't want someone saying, oh yeah, we do this, we're ADA compliant. I mean, make sure and have some standards in there. You can use the WCAG, standards that we mentioned a second ago. So make sure it's in your agreement, though, that they're indemnifying you, and make sure you have the standards they're going to make it compliant up to, because the last thing you want to do is create this website, pay for it, and then realize, uh-oh, we have a problem. Be able to go back to that web developer if there's a problem and say, you're going to fix this for me. So the liability of these websites, or the liability, associated with these websites, this is really becoming an increasing problem. And I know some people roll their eyes and say, websites like ADA, I cannot tell you how many lenders I've represented on this. And the good news again is if you take it the right way, you're usually able to get out of these pretty easily. They're not that bad, okay? But to give you a sense of it, 51 banks were sued in 2018. in 2019, it wasn't just banks, it was mortgage brokers, it was lenders of all different types, sizes and shapes, even really small brokers I saw get these letters. And that's just expanding further and further. So it's getting higher numbers. I don't think there are numbers yet I've heard about 2019. I bet it's double what it was in 2018, if not higher than double, more than double. I think the thing that's biggest is the number of smaller companies getting hit with this. Now, again, your defenses, you have a bunch of them. Does the ADA even apply? As I said, expensive, very legally involved, but real expensive from a legal position and not clear because the trend is clearly going the other way. Is it an undue burden? Can you not change it? I gave you my example of the silly animal videos, right? Does it change the character or ability of the website to function? It's kind of along the same lines what I just explained there. So those are things that you've got to think about, in terms of the defenses do you have. In most of our cases, those are not going to be viable defenses. The biggest one would be applicability. And as I said before, I think that is a weaker and weaker defense by the day. Now, what is your liability associated with these? Well, they can do fines or penalties up to $75,000. If it's repeat offenses, that can change. Obviously, this is the biggest one. You've got to pay for attorney's fees, not just your own. You've got to pay for their attorney's fees. So when I do have that lender who calls you up and says, oh, this is BS, I want to fight this, this isn't fair. Okay, but understand something. Not only going to pay me, you're going to pay them. And the more they fight with you and the more you have to go through these things, arguing whether it does or doesn't apply, you're going to be on the hook for their bills. Wouldn't it just be easier to make your website, if we can, compliant, right? Now, again, if we can't, that's a different story. But look, in most lawsuits, I'll tell you when I get them, I'm pretty aggressive in how I handle cases. And I don't look at them as, well, what can we do to make this thing go away? This one, I feel differently about. And the reason why is because it's a spider's web, right? The more you claw, the more you scratch, the more the web gets all over you and you can't move anymore. So you get further embroiled in because your liability increases. The more you're fighting, the more they're fighting, the more attorney's fees go up, right? You're now further and further and get sucked further and further in. And so what I suggest strongly is when you get one of these letters, buy yourself some time. Get a company, we can tell you, I can connect you they are, to do an assessment. Always do that assessment, by the way, through an attorney so that the assessment itself is privileged. Don't do it yourself because if they come back with some terrible report, you got to turn it over. So very important to gauge counsel on these. So then you find out how much you got to do. Most times, again, it's not that bad. You pay a few $1,000s, they review it, they make the fixes you can, you negotiate that instead of fighting about it, which again, more attorney's fees, more liability, right? You negotiate that out. With the other side, you come to some meeting in the minds because they also realize there's no certainty, there's no specific standard, so they're generally going to work with you, especially if you work with them. And then you get in and out of this thing pretty quickly without a ton of money. Again, at any point you can pull the I want to fight to the death cord, right? If you want to do that, but this is not those cases. And remember one more thing. When you go in court on these, and let's say your website has a problem, do you really want to be the one, right? I mean, think about it from a PR standpoint. It's not ideal, right? I mean, if you're saying, hey, you're kind of saying, well, not my problem, they can't see my website. Not the best PR angle, you'd probably agree. But the other thing is this, if in fact there's an actual problem where there are people who actually can't access your website legitimately, from a business perspective, don't you want them to be able to access it? Especially as you think about baby boomers getting older, that's when your visual acuity is compromised more and more. I mean, you see where I'm going here. So how do you really win when you fight these? I'm not saying there aren't and might not be situations that would occur in, but the vast majority, you're better off from a business standpoint. I mean, just to give you one other example, I had a guy who called me and said, well, I'm just going to turn my website off. Could you do that? Yeah, I think you could. You're not going to have a website now. But let's think about this for a minute, right? Is that a good business move? I mean, what would you do if you were going to do a mortgage yourself and you said, okay, well, where can I get, do you have a website? No, we don't have one. Wouldn't you think, hold on, right? Like, what's going on here? It wouldn't help your business. So that's one where, you're cutting off your nose to spite your face. And I think that in a lot of cases, like a lot of these cases, this is exactly what happens when you fight. You end up cutting off your nose to spite your face. So as much as I'm not the guy who, when people come to me, I say settle. That's not how I look at these things at all. But these cases are ones where I find it difficult to figure out how you win by fighting in most cases, either from a practical business perspective and or from a legal perspective. So it seems like that's the better way. And again, there may be a case that I get a hold of one day where that's not the case, where that's not the situation. But I find 99% of the time, and all the percent of the times I've dealt with it, that these are easier dealt with practically than from a, let's fight it out standpoint. So I know this has been a kind of quick presentation, but I wanted to give you guys kind of the overview of this. The website issue is, let's just break it down. It's real. It's not BS. But the good news, and there are people who are literally hunting around for these websites to bring claims. The good news is most of them are not really interested in getting a lot of money. They're interested in actually just, at least at this point, because there isn't a lot of money really to gain. They're interested though in bringing these things into compliance, which you can often do pretty easily without a ton of expense. And so these can just be learning lessons. Now, in an ideal world, if you can, I'd look at it before I get the letter, because when you get the letter, there usually is some negotiation about their attorney's fees. It's usually not a lot of money if you handle it the right way. But why even have that conversation if you don't have to? So I will tell you that it is happening. It is happening with increasing frequency. What the conversation I used to have once every couple months is now a conversation I have almost once every day. So I would strongly recommend two things. One, if you have a website now, and you're planning on redesigning, or you're in the process of getting a new website, make sure that's a piece of it with indemnification by the developer. Number two, if you've already got your website set up, have somebody take a look at it. It doesn't cost that much money, and a lot of times the fixes are pretty easy. But it's better to do that now than later when you have to deal with it, under time limitations and so forth and so on. So I hope that information you've found helpful. If you guys do have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And I do have, there is some time for questions now. If you wanna type any in, we've got a little chat log. I do see one question in there right now. The question we have is, how do I know if I'm in a jurisdiction that requires me to be ADA compliant? Well, I could go through and give you the geographic breakdown of the First, Third, and Ninth Circuits. I wouldn't do it. I'll tell you why. The cases are just going further and farther along. Courts are less and less reluctant. And as I said, the functionality of websites is such that the old website, that really just was touchy-feely and didn't have really any true commerce oriented, especially in this industry, it just really doesn't exist anymore. So I would, strongly suggest, and make sure one other thing you got to remember too, is that this doesn't just apply to your website, it would apply to loan officers. So if loan officers or branch managers have their own websites, you want to make sure those get covered too by this in some form or fashion. Again, there may be applicability issues with those a little bit more about whether the rules apply, because those might still be a little touchy-feely. But the good news is if they're connected to your website, which they should be for like really doing any real business, then you should be okay if you've gotten your website ADA compliant. So I don't see any other questions in the queue. So I hope you guys have found this useful, and I look forward to speaking to you guys in the future. Thank you and have a great day.